Hey guys, apologies for the voice today. Obviously, I'm a little bit wrecked from my illness for the past couple of days. We're going to talk today, though, about a couple of really important laws and treaties as far as biodiversity and really as far as protecting wildlife on the planet as a whole and in the United States in particular. You're going to do a lot more work on this on your law wikis, but I wanted to sort of briefly give you an overview of these things to sort of get you jump started into your own research. So the first and one of the most important things worldwide for biodiversity is what's called CITES, and this was the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. This happened in 1975, and essentially the overall idea here is that this is the point in sort of the fledgling environmental movement where they said, you know what, one of the ways that we can protect animals and plants that are in danger of going extinct is that if we ban the sale and trade of them, because a lot of them obviously are being sold and traded in different ways. And so this treaty was signed by 175 countries. It bans the hunting, capturing, selling of any threatened or endangered species. Now, you know from our previous lessons that there's a little bit of controversy about the defining of threatened or endangered. Okay, so obviously that's a bit of a problem. But what it does specifically list is 900 species whose parts or live specimens cannot be traded. Now, it also restricts the trade of a bunch of other species as well that you can see there, and you'll get more into in your wiki. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that those things don't happen. We talked before about poaching. That still can occur. But what it means is that there's actually now some sort of mechanism that says not only is this sort of morally and ethically wrong, but it's actually legally wrong and for these specific species as well. Now, there's some pretty serious issues with it. The first one is, 175 countries is a lot, but it's not all of the countries in the world. And then the second point here is pretty important, is that member countries can actually exempt themselves from certain species. So if they have a certain species that they think is somehow important to their country to be, bought and sold or harvested or whatever, they can exempt themselves out. And that's kind of a pretty big glaring flaw. And then, of course, enforcement is going to vary. This isn't something that is there's no real UN task force or police that comes in and tells people they can't do these things. And so it's up to the individual member countries to enforce the law. And so depending on what level of finances or whatever they put into the enforcement, that also affects how well CITES actually works. Regardless, and despite those problems, still a really important watershed moment in the environmental movement to say, we want to protect biodiversity. These species are important. We don't want species to go extinct through human intervention. The second thing that I want to briefly talk about today is the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is 191 countries, and they're committing to reducing biodiversity loss and to sharing benefits of all of the world's genetic resources. Again, same problem that there's no real enforcement mechanisms, and this is a big one that is not ratified by the United States. Now, typically when the United States doesn't ratify something like this, obviously there are political reasons behind that. That's a big part of it, and usually those political reasons are driven by economic motivators, that there's a fear that if we enforce this sort of law that maybe some company isn't going to be able to develop the land that they own, and therefore there aren't going to be jobs in that specific area. So don't just assume it's because we necessarily hate the environment, but remember we're trying to play a balancing act here between all of these things, and in a lot of cases the economic interests, politically speaking, outweigh the environmental interests. So the CBD, important, you're going to put this into your wikis, but isn't something the United States was willing to ratify, at least at the time that I put some of this stuff together. Now, the real big Megillah for us, as far as environmental laws, is the Endangered Species Act, the ESA. It was first passed in 1973. It was amended 3 times. You need to make sure that when you do your wikis that you put in the amendments. But what really matters here is that this establishes 2 agencies whose job essentially it is to protect endangered species in the United States. The National Marine Fisheries Service, and then perhaps more importantly, or what we hear of more often, certainly in Tennessee, is going to be the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. Both of these agencies, they have the job, they can add species to the endangered and threatened list. They can remove species from the threatened and endangered list. And this term right here is what's really sort of super important. Let me circle that for you, is that they're going to do it theoretically at least purely on biological terms, that they're not doing it from an economic or a political consideration, that these two agencies are supposed to do this purely on biological terms. Now, of course, these are governmental agencies, probably going to be some politics involved one way or another, but their decisions are supposed to be made purely on biological terms. The things that are on this list are then illegal to buy, sell, hunt, kill, collect, injure in any way, and, okay, it also serves to protect their habitats. That means that you can't build something if it's going to destroy the habitat or endanger the habitat of an endangered or threatened species. And the punishments can be actually pretty severe. There are criminal penalties, there are monetary penalties. So this is kind of a big deal. And certainly, again, a pretty big moment in United States environmental history. In addition to just putting species on the list, both agencies are supposed to develop plans to help species recover. There are a couple of really awesome case studies that we'll get into regarding American alligators in Florida, and then, of course, bald eagles, where these agencies put plans into place to say this is how we're going to protect them and regrow the populations. And in both cases, those populations did regrow and recover pretty well. The gators, in fact, so well that they actually instituted hunting seasons for them because they were getting a little overpopulated in some areas. There are 573 species from other countries that have to be checked in at 9 specific ports, and you can put those ports again in your wiki. The act isn't without controversy, just with almost any law in the United States, but particularly environmental laws. There are lots of people on both sides that want to change the acts. There are people on, we could say, the environmental side that want to strengthen the act, that want to strengthen the penalties, that want to put more things on the list, that want to make it harder for companies to get exemptions and stuff like that. Of course, there are a lot of economic entities that want to have the opportunity to get exemptions in certain areas so that they can maybe build a manufacturing facility, or that they can be able to put their waste products into a certain river, or to be able to have a certain amount of pollution that they can put out. All of those things, there are people on both sides that want to be able to change it, and that's what some of those amendments have come up as a result of, and I want you guys to research, and we're going to talk about what those amendments do. The National Wildlife Refuge System that was established in the United States is another pretty big, important thing. There's 548 of these refuges set apart. The idea behind them is that they're set aside theoretically from development. This is the Alaskan National Wildlife Refuge, and you may remember for the past decade or so, this has been a pretty big deal because there's been a lot of debate about we should be able to, people believe that we should be able to extract oil from there because there's a lot of oil reserves there. Of course, environmentalists don't like that idea, economically speaking, and really politically speaking in a lot of ways, because again, the more domestic oil we have, theoretically, the less oil we import, and that gets us out of some of the Middle Eastern conflicts and those sorts of things. So what this means, though, is that even though these refuges get set up, again, there are always sort of loopholes and stuff and ways that we try to find around them. Or in the case of the ANWR here, the ANWR, that people are pressuring politicians to be able to carve out an exemption for them and say, hey, no, in this case, we're going to be able to go in and log or mine or whatever those specific things are. Which, I mean, you might kind of argue sort of defeats the point of having a wildlife refuge system in the first place. Of course, there are lots of other ways to protect species. We can set up arboreta. That would be an arboretum is one. Arboreta is plural. Botanical gardens. We have a botanical garden here in Knoxville. We can establish seed and gene banks. Now, of course, that is not going to protect the species now, but what it does is it can protect their DNA so that maybe at some point in the future we can reintroduce them. That's sort of a hot topic nowadays. Of course, zoos and aquariums are other ways that we can protect species, but of course then they're in captivity. And one of the things that we've discovered, particularly with animals, is they're particularly hard to get them to breed very well in captivity compared to in the wild. And so that in many ways that's not really as an effective way to protect species as we might wish. All right, guys, I hope that gives you at least the starting point. Then we're going to jump off and dive into a little bit more about these laws and treaties. Sorry for the voice. Hope that you can still understand everything in the video.